Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom news briefing. I'm Sandy Close with EMS. We have a back-to-school news briefing focus today with three key issues, among others, that are particularly important. The first is teacher shortages. 233,000 teachers left the profession during the pandemic and have not returned. 41 states say they will be short of teachers, particularly in STEM education, as the school year begins. Students also face gaps in learning, exacerbated by the pandemic. Children lost about 1/3 of the learning they would have received during the normal year, resulting in much lower test scores, especially in low-income districts. Finally, students face an increasingly polarized environment in many districts as parents and politicians attempt to reshape curriculums and school libraries. Our speakers will discuss these challenges, among others. We ask our speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters, and we will send a video of today's briefing with bios for each speaker and contact information to all our participants before the end of the day. So we welcome our speakers for today's discussion. Dr. Shaun Harper, Provost Professor at the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education, and the USC Marshall School of Business. Casey Meehan, Freedom to Read Program Director at Penn America. Dr. Tuan Nguyen, Assistant Professor in the College of Education at Kansas State University, and Evelyn Alamand, founder of Our Voice, Communities for Quality Education in Los Angeles. I'm turning the microphone over to my colleague, EMS Health Editor, Sunita Sarabji, our moderator today. Sunita, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Let's begin with Dr. Tuan Nguyen from Kansas State University. Dr. Nguyen has done an incredible amount of research regarding teacher shortages, charting several years. Dr. Nguyen, welcome, and we welcome your insights.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm Tuan Nguyen. I've just recently been promoted to associate professor at the college at Kansas State University. So I'm going to talk about the teacher supply, retention, and shortage in the United States. They're all really pieces of the same puzzle. So really quickly, a background on the teacher staffing challenges. So we know that teachers are critical to student learning. And over the last several years, we've had a lot of news reports suggesting that we have critical shortages in many
Dr. Nguyen, may I ask you to slow down for our interpreters?
Oh, sure. Once
Thank
again,
you.
Excited for this. And in response to these shortages, states have really lower requirements for certified teachers, substitute teachers, and they have even used retired teachers, administrators, parents, and even the National Guard to fill vacant positions. At the same time, we have seen recent declines in the teacher production and COVID-related uptick in teacher turnover. And really, up to this point, neither the federal government nor the majority of states collect enough information about the teacher shortage. So my team and I then tried to meet this challenge to address this gap. And before we look at the results, I just want to make sure that we break down this idea of teacher shortage a little bit more. So one is that there is the vacancy part. So these are teaching positions that are posted but are not filled. They can't find anybody to fill these positions. And then two, it's underqualification. So this is where you have teaching positions that are filled by teachers who don't have standard certification. So they can be filled by people with emergency certifications, or they can have teachers teaching out of subject. So an English teacher, for instance, teaching mathematics. All right. So that's sort of the background that we're trying to address here. My team and I work together to collect all this information as much as we can for as many states as possible across the United States. And we put it together on a website called www.teachershortages.com. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit of that website here and kind of share with you what we have found a little bit. So as you can see here, we have data for the majority of states in the United States. If you hover over each state, you will see the number of vacant positions in that state and for the particular year. And if you click on that link, it will send you to one of the sources that we have that indicate how do we know this information. All right. So when you look at this map, you can see a lot of variations in terms of vacant positions across the United States. But in particular, you see there is a lot of vacant positions in the southeast area. So states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia have more than 3,000 vacant positions. Florida is at the highest, where they are nearly at 4,000 vacant positions as of 21-22. And as of last year, it has gone up to more than 5,000 vacant positions. Overall, there are at least 36,500 vacant positions in the United States. That's nothing to say of underqualified teachers. We estimate there are approximately 160,000 underqualified teachers in the United States. So if you go to the website, there are more informations and more maps that you can look at, all right? But this is not the only piece of the puzzle. So what else is there in terms of the teacher shortage? Well, there are two additional parts. One is the teacher supply. So how many teachers do we have coming into the profession? And then teacher retention or teacher attrition. How many people are we able to hold on to year after year? All right, so I'm going to now talk about that. All right, so here's a little outline of the three factors that contribute to the teacher shortage. So we have the current teacher shortage, we have the teacher supply, and we have the teacher retention. All right, so what do we know about the teacher supply? So over the last 10, 12 years, what we have seen is that there has been a substantial decline in people's interest in becoming teachers, okay? So this is national data. The blue line shows you the enrollment numbers over time. The red line shows you the number of completion over time. These are people who are certified to be teachers. So you can see in 2009, 2010, we have around 700,000 people who are enrolled in teacher prep programs. That has dropped to about 400,000 by 2015, 2016, so about a 40% decline. It has gone up a little bit, but it has gone back down. In general, there's been a 35 to 40% decrease in the number of people who want to become teachers. What's worse, however, is this red line. So these are people who complete the teacher prep program, who are certified in to teach. As you can see, they peaked around 2010, and they have generally declined every single year since then, almost monotonically. So the number of people who are wanting to become teachers are declining, and those who are ready to teach are also declining. Well, what does this look like for STEM teachers in particular? This is even worse for STEM teachers. In 2010, 2011, we have around 32,000 teachers who are certified to teach STEM. That has dropped significantly over time, as you can see here, to around 22,000 by 2019. So for some subject areas like STEM, math, science, engineering, there has been substantial decline in the teacher supply. All right. Well, what about that last piece? Teacher retention, teacher attrition. Well, prior to the pandemic, on average, about 8% of teachers leave the profession every year nationally. But in the last 2 years, after the onset of COVID, this has increased substantially. In Alaska, this has increased to 22% as of last year. In Arkansas and in Illinois, about 12%. And in North Carolina and South Carolina, about 15, 16%. So instead of having that 8%, we're now looking at, 12% or 16% or 50% to 100% increase in the number of people who are leaving the profession every year. That is a huge, huge issue that is facing our education right now. So what do we know? Well, we have the current teacher shortage from year to year. We know that the supply of teachers is decreasing over time. We know that teacher retention is decreasing, or teacher attrition is increasing. So this suggests that future teacher shortages will increase. So in fact, my team and I will have updated maps and data available in the next couple of weeks to show how that has changed from 21-22 to 22-23, and even maybe 23-24 for this year. Now, there are a couple of other factors here that we don't have time to fully discuss today, but student enrollment and ESSER funds also play a role. For many states like California, for instance, they have lost a lot of students, right? About 250,000 students are missing in California since the pandemic, right? They are going to be homeschooling and they're going to private school. Also, we have ESSER funds that states and districts have been using in order to hire more teachers, to create positions, and those ESSER funds are going to run out. So potentially for some states, there may be a surplus of teachers who, due to declining student enrollment and increasing ESSER funds, but for many, many other states, there will still be a severe teacher shortage in terms of vacancy and underqualifications. So over the next couple of years, we really have to think nationally about how we can work on this imbalanced picture. Thank you very much. And now I think there are questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wen. There are questions, and I will go to Orhan Arkut first. Orhan, please ask your question.
Yes. Hi. My question is this shortages related with the teacher salary? Because as far as I know, the teachers is not satisfied with their salary, even the teacher aide and the teacher aide, and there is another teachers, so they work in the school for specific classes. So the salary, they complaining about the salary. Is this related with the salary? If they increase the salary, so do you think this shortages will close ASAP, or what do you think?
So salary is a very important factor for in terms of teacher shortage, as well as teacher supply, right, and retention. We know that more salary means that more people will be interested and less people will leave the profession. But it's not the only factor. You also have to take into consideration of teacher working conditions and how teachers are portrayed, in the media. So salary is definitely one factor, but it's not the only factor that matters.
Interesting. What are some of the other factors, Dr. Wen? Why are teachers leaving the profession, especially post-pandemic?
Well, so, during the first couple of years of the pandemic, right, a lot of people weren't sure about what's happening. We weren't sure how we're going to have jobs. So that prevented a lot of people from leaving the profession because teaching is seen as a very stable profession. But after the onset of the pandemic, now teachers are realizing that many of their districts and schools aren't providing them with the working conditions that they would need in order to thrive, right? They're asked to teach too many classes. They're asked to take on too many additional responsibilities. And for some of them, they even have to work second or third jobs to make ends meet. So that is going to drive people out of the profession. So I see a question about, do you have data for California? So for last year, we did not have vacancy information for California. We do have underqualification information, but this year we do have some estimates for California, and that should be coming out, like I said, in about a week or so.
Fantastic. And our next question comes from Alina Gonzalez-Dockery. Alina?
Hello, and thank you so much, Tuan. I was curious if, like, the shortage of students or teachers in Florida, we now have school choice, where part of the funding, which would be allocated per student, would follow the student whether they go to a private school, a charter school, or public school.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if that has any effect regarding the teacher attrition issues, as well as the decline in student enrollment in traditional schools.
So I think a lot of us are working on answering that question in a rigorous way. But I'll point to, say, Arizona, for instance, where, you know, school choice is proliferated there, right? And Arizona, if you look to the map, and we'll show this next week, has one of the highest rates of teacher vacancy in the United States. So school choice may not be the answer here. That's from the evidence that we can tell so far.
Thank you. I'd like to consolidate a couple of questions and ask you, are there attempts at both the state and federal level? Are there initiatives to build out a pipeline of teachers, especially in STEM education?
So I think we have tried to do that over the last 10, 15 years. Every administration over the last 10, 15 years has tried to increase interest in STEM education in general, and then STEM teachers in particular. But so far, we haven't been able to really move that needle, right? I mean, you saw that evidence before, that STEM teacher production has just decreased over time. So in some ways, we have to think about really more targeted policy interventions that get at STEM teachers. So salary here is going to play a big role, right? So, you know, the questions you have to ask is, why would somebody with a STEM degree would choose to go and become a STEM teacher when they can make 80, 90,000 working in industry relative to, you know, 30, 40, 50,000 in education? Plus, there are all these additional, you know, toxic political climates around teachers, right? Or in teaching profession right now, right? So when we think about the attacks on what teachers can or cannot say in terms of racism or social emotional learning or diversity and inclusion and equity, it's a hard environment for teachers right now. So we have to really think about the narrative, what it means to be a teacher in this country, and change that around so that more people want to become teachers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wen. There are several questions in the chat, and I hope you do address them. We move on to Dr. Shaun Harper from USC. Yes, I'm sorry. Dr. Harper, please join the call. Welcome. Dr. Harper is going to talk about the politicized environment that our students are now facing. Welcome.
Fantastic. Well, hey, thank you for having me once again. I always enjoy connecting with this group. Let me also thank all of the attendees for attending this important briefing. In just a few moments here, I want to talk about and give some guidance on how to report on these politicized attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion that are happening in our nation's schools. I don't want to take for granted that everybody knows what those are. So let me very quickly just sort of lay out what is happening nationally. Books that include LGBTQ persons and families have been banned in many school districts all across the United States. Toni Morrison classics. I love a good Toni Morrison classic. Toni Morrison classics have been pulled from school and public library shelves. And it's not just Toni Morrison. There's many other very influential Indigenous and influential other authors of color whose books are being banned across the country. We're going to hear more about book bans later in today's briefing. 44 states have introduced bills since January 2021 that have aimed to ban critical race theory, even though critical race theory is definitely absolutely not being taught in K-12 schools. Nonetheless, it's been used as a boogeyman, right, to get like really afraid school board members to ban these things. But it's not just CRT proper. Also, other efforts to teach about America's racial past and present have been either banned or suppressed. There have been 44 states that have introduced legislation. In 18 of those states, legislation has been passed. Here's a map from Education Week. Ed Week has been tracking this in real time. The states in blue are those where state level bans have been enacted on the teaching about race and racism and racial topics. The states in red are those where legislation was indeed introduced, but ultimately failed in the state house, or the governor ultimately vetoed the bill when it reached his, or their desk. The states in yellow, this map is about 2 weeks old. So it could be that some of the yellow states have since made revisions or enacted legislation, but the states in yellow were the ones at least 2 weeks ago where legislation was still pending. And then there are those of us in the lowly gray states. California, where I live and teach, is one of those gray states. Those are the states where there has been no state level legislative attempt. But I want to offer a cautionary note about the gray states. Even in a gray state like California, that is notoriously progressive and has amassed for itself a reputation nationally of being so liberal, so committed to diversity and inclusion, there are several districts throughout the state of California where there have been district level bans on the teaching of race and racial topics and so on. So local school boards throughout the state, even though there hasn't been a state level attempt. So I want to offer that, it's probably not just California among the few gray states where there have been district level bans. The same trend is happening in higher education. The Chronicle of Higher Ed is also mapping anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion legislative activities on its website. And you can go to chronicle.com and see their map in real time. Many states, in addition to the state level book bans and bans about teaching about race, many states have also placed restrictions on the expenditure of public funds on DEI professional learning experiences for teachers, counselors, school leaders, and staff. So it's not just, taking these topics out of the curriculum and out of classrooms, but also taking money out of professional development budgets in school districts all across the country for K-12 employees, as well as at higher ed institutions where in Florida, for example, or perhaps even a more recent example is in Texas. There's been such an aggressive defunding of cultural centers and multicultural programs and so on those campuses in higher ed. In Florida, presidential candidate and now and Governor Ron DeSantis has banned public spending on DEI initiatives at colleges and universities in his state, and it has created a sort of replicable blueprint for other states across the country who are following Governor DeSantis's lead and efforts there. Why is this happening? Well, actually, before I get to the why it's happening, let me just point out what's real and what's not real. So here's my advice for journalists who are covering these things. I strongly urge you to challenge the logic flaws in unsubstantiated claims that are made about what is and isn't happening in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools. Here's one logic flaw. Nationally, nearly 80% of K-12 teachers are white, and the overwhelming majority of them are white women. So the logic flaw here is that there are tons of woke white women teaching critical race theory to third graders or teaching eighth graders about America's racial history in ways that are inappropriate and racist and so on. That doesn't make sense. Challenge people on that logic flaw in your interviews with sources or with misinformed people who are spreading mis and disinformation. Another logic flaw. In our work, well, let me start here. Educators avoid talking about race in school, in part because they don't know how. So in our work here at the USC Race and Equity Center, which I founded and direct, we do work all across the United States with K-12 educators. Consistently over the 12-year lifespan of the center, we've heard from teachers and school staff members and leaders that race is a taboo in our school. We stay away from it, in large part because it feels like it might be an explosive powder keg, or we don't want to make people uncomfortable or say the wrong thing. And ultimately, we don't talk about race as adults with each other in our school because we don't know how. We never learn how to do that in our teacher education program or in our principal certification program. So the logic flaw that I am inviting you as journalists to push back on is that, people who don't know how to talk about race with each other, these are adults who don't know how to do it with each other. In their classrooms, they're talking to kids about these things? No, probably not. Absolutely not is the real answer, right? Let me give you one more logic flaw. Teachers and school leaders learn very little about race and racism in colleges and schools of education. I can say that declaratively as a person who has been a professor for 20 years in 3 schools of education in different geographic regions of the US. I can also say it as a past president of the American Educational Research Association, the largest body of researchers from schools and colleges of education. But perhaps most persuasively, I can say it from a research standpoint. As a person who is in hundreds of schools every year and who understands from my research what educators did and didn't learn about race, I'm telling you, in 2023, one can still graduate from a school of education and have but one course on so-called multicultural education in one's entire teacher education program, right? The problem with the one course on multicultural education is that it is super stuffed with everything. So in other words, teachers tell me and my research team that, well, yeah, in our multicultural education course, we did talk about race a little bit for like a week or two, but then we had to move on to class. Then we had to move on to ability. Then we had to move on to gender. Then we had to move on to so on and so forth. So the logic flaw here is that educators are teaching something in schools that they themselves never learned, right? So I invite you as journalists, as you're writing about these politicized attacks on DEI, talk with teachers, interview principals and assistant principals to get their perspectives on what is and isn't happening in their schools and in their classrooms. They will tell you, we're not teaching that stuff in our classrooms. Like, that's just not it. I'll just say here quickly as an anecdote, I have a nephew who is in 3rd grade. Prince is his name. I saw him a week ago when I was visiting Georgia. Prince, as a 3rd grader, understands the realities of what is and isn't being taught in his classrooms, right? So as I talk with Prince about book bans and all of these things, he's like, Uncle Shaun, we're not learning that stuff in our classrooms. Like, no, that's just like not what's happening. So I would also suggest to you, in addition to talking with teachers about what they are and aren't doing, also talk with young people about what is and isn't occurring as an act of professional social responsibility, or better yet, journalistic social responsibility. I invite you to use your platforms as journalists to counter the mis and disinformation that is occurring in schools. Look, I know we want to have some time for discussion, so I will just conclude here by saying that here at the USC Race and Equity Center, we are pushing back against these politicized attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools. One way that we're doing that is we've created what we've called the National DEI Defense Commission. It is a commission of experts who are taking stock of what is and isn't happening in K-12 schools and in higher ed institutions. So, do feel free to reach out to me and us, and I can connect you with not only folks on our team here at the center, but also other experts who are part of the commission. We're also, about a month ago, we launched what we call the National DEI Defense Fund. In the interest of time, I'll just drop a link to it in the chat, and you can read about the various ways that we are fundraising here at the center to then reinvest in communities all across the country where books have been banned, where teachers have been fired for teaching about race, so on and so forth.
Dr. Harper, we need to move on to the next speaker, but there was one very interesting question that came through on text, and I want to ask this to you. It's a little bit abstract, but the not teaching of race in schools, how does that impact the students that the students of color? And this is a broad question.
Yeah, it impacts students of color and white students alike. It's a serious threat to our democracy when we deny young people the educational opportunity to learn about America's racial past and present, and then we send them into the workforce and into adulthood, not knowing these things. It is inevitably going to lead to interracial conflict among adults. Is going to lead to reckless policymaking and decision-making when those young people become the next generation of congresspeople, governors, mayors, and so on. And they're making policy decisions that affect literally millions of Americans in a so-called colorblind way. It's going to have devastating effects on the exacerbation, really, of racial inequities. So that's just one sort of concise response. I have a more elaborate response that I'm putting in the chat. I wrote a Forbes article that is titled "Why Politicized Attacks on DEI Are Occurring and How They're Bad for America." So I offer additional insights in that piece.
Dr. Harper, thank
I'll
you.
stop here.
Thank you so much. And could you please stay on until the end? And there are several questions for you in the chat. If you could answer those questions, that would be terrific.
I'll answer as many as I can in the chat, but I got to run to another speaking engagement just before this ends, but I'll hang on as long as I can.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right.
We move on to Casey Meehan of PEN America, who's going to be speaking specifically on book bans. Casey, welcome.
Thank you again for having, and really feel just fantastic to be here and bring PEN's perspective, but how it all couples together. I just, it all is speaking together. So let me try and share my screen here. All right. All right, this looks good, yes?
Yes,
okay,
you're on.
And I'll pay attention to time too. So I'm here to talk a little bit about book bans, as well as the growing climate of censorship that we see happening across the US in public schools. To ground us, I wanted to start with some definitions just around this national ed scare that we're tracking. So this is a campaign. Is my Wi-Fi okay too, or am I a little slow?
You're fine, Casey.
Okay, it seems to just hiccup, but okay, so PEN America is tracking a national campaign. We call it the Ed Scare. This campaign is efforts to suppress specific viewpoints and concepts from educational institutions. Much of this is happening in public schools, as well as public libraries and higher ed institutions. We see the Ed Scare relying on authoritarian tactics. We see how it's censoring the works of writers, interfering with the rights of students, undermining the role of teachers and librarians and professors and other educators and administrators in our schools. and also sowing division within our communities. Penn has played a critical role here in driving the national conversation on these issues, emphasizing how book bans are suppressing diverse voices and compounding or compromising the school's ability to prepare students to be thoughtful and engaged citizens. So our work really centers around research, communications, policy advocacy, and litigation, as well as coalition building and education. I just quickly want to start with some context on book bans. I'll borrow a little bit here from Dr. Harper as well around some logic flaws that exist in these conversations. When we think about or when we track book bans, we see that there are unprecedented levels to censor books in K-12 public schools. These book bans are overwhelmingly targeting middle grade and young adult literature. About 71% of all books swept up in book banning efforts are intended for young adult audiences, or even younger than that, picture books and middle grade books. You know, by definition, literature for young people is already designated as age appropriate. It's conceptualized, it's created, it's developed, and ultimately promoted and brought into schools in that context. So again, there's a logic flaw here that we often push back against around this idea that there's somehow obscene or pornographic or harmful material that's been brought into schools that needs to be removed. So just starting there sort of with that, bringing that logic flaw out here today too. Our definition of book bans is just worth restating here. So we consider a ban anytime anytime access to a book is either restricted or diminished. That can be for a limited or indefinite period of time. We have seen the way, if we're just looking at numbers, that the way that bans have continued to grow from semester to semester to semester since we started tracking in 2021. Looking at the first half of the 2022-2023 school year, we record over 1,400 instances of individual books being banned. This equates to over 800 unique titles that are being removed from access for students in schools. Again, this is an increase from the prior 6 months. And we have an upcoming report coming out in September, and we expect to see instances only grow in over the next 6 months, or the second half of the school year that we're in. Efforts to drive book bans are influenced by several factors. We primarily track the influences of groups and legislation in driving book bans. In the 2021-2022 school year, we followed a set of groups as they coordinated to censor books in schools across the country. These groups include Moms for Liberty, U.S. Parents Involved in Education, No Left Turn for Education, Mass Resistance, Parents' Rights in Education, Mary in the Library, and many others. The majority of these groups formed around 2020, 2021, and many of our books that we count as banned have been linked to the activities of these groups and their local chapters. Some of the groups espouse Christian nationalist political views, while others have mission statements oriented towards reforming public schools, and in some cases, driving towards more religious education. In addition to the efforts of groups, we see the way that the influences to censor books have been charged by state legislation. We often see the way in which vague and confusing legislation is enacted and subsequently is the effects are the removal of books in schools. We also see the way in which vague legislation can empower these local groups that I just mentioned and increase intimidation. New legislation introduces penalties for superintendents, for educators, for librarians. And we see this as just another way that groups and legislation are chilling the atmosphere on education across the country. In this fall, we saw a heightened influence of legislation in several states, certainly in Florida, following a trio of legislation enacted across the school year that bans instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity, that prohibits educators from discussing the advantages or disadvantages that individuals may have based on race, and mandates that schools must catalog every book in their shelves, including those found in their classroom libraries. We've also followed legislation in Missouri that prohibits sexually explicit material, legislation in Utah that similarly prohibits sensitive instructional material. In Texas, we're watching legislation that would require individual booksellers to rate books sold to public schools for their sexual content. And just this week, we are following response to legislation in Iowa that requires only age appropriate material in schools, which is quite vague, and also prohibits instruction on sexuality and gender identity. Oftentimes we see the way in which legislation is replicated from state to state and modeled from each other. So when we think about this school year and this upcoming fall, what Penn America is watching is continued responses to state legislation. We're following upcoming legislative cycles. All of this is showing up in pressure to close classrooms and school libraries, to review entire collections of books, to prohibit certain types of content and instruction. We also see the introduction of a special magistrate uniquely in Florida, which would provide another sort of cost and burden to districts that are facing excessive book challenges and bans. We will follow, again, continued pressures at the district level from groups that I mentioned earlier, as well as some ongoing litigation around school districts in Florida, Arkansas, and Texas laws, all of which are pushing back against book bans, the criminalization of librarians and bookstores, as well as these newly introduced rating systems for sexual content. I think, we also are following lots of what has been discussed before me around some confounding concerns around school board elections and teacher shortages and learning losses, and how this is all playing together to affect students in our public school systems. Just a quick nod to say, there are efforts that we know work in pushing back against book bans, and we need to continue to see coordinated efforts to resist the suppression of free speech in our public schools. We always, point to student activists as leading the way, and also just want to land with a few sort of what we would recommend as strategies for defending the freedom to read. So, encouraging folks to continue to be informed, to battle some of these myths and logic flaws that we've talked through, to be an advocate in your own communities for the freedom to read, to vote in your school board and library board elections, to volunteer, and of course, to consider, supporting groups like Penn America and other local advocacy groups defending the freedom to read for students in public schools and more broadly.
Casey, thank you so much. I would like you to take a question from Peter Sherman to start out this conversation. Peter.
Hi, sorry, I was muted. Apologies for that.
No worries.
So, I posed my question for Dr. Harper, but I think Casey or Tuan can also perhaps answer. I'm curious why all of this is happening at a moment when, we're looking at the nation sort of becoming a minority majority country as demographics shift and immigrant populations grow. And it's just kind of ironic that we're seeing all of this at that inflection point. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Casey?
Sure. Like somewhat ironic and perhaps a bit intentional as well. I think what we see too is in 2020 and 2021, we saw a lot of efforts across schools to be more diverse and inclusive in their library and classroom collections. And, our sense is that this resistance is directly responding to that, to efforts to, increasingly think about all students in a school population and how do we represent those many voices there. So in some ways it's, it feels exactly to what you suggested, like deeply connected, that it's not accidental that that efforts to prohibit certain instruction on certain topics and to remove books representing LGBTQ plus identities or books that talk about race and racism. It's certainly, we see this as very much so connected and related.
Thank you. Dr. Harper, do you want to address Peter's question?
Yes, I will do so succinctly. Peter, I just put a link in the chat to a Forbes article that I wrote that offers numerous explanations for why this is happening, as well as, again, how it is bad for America. So the link is in the chat. I also PDF'd my slides. Those are in the chat as well. I got to run to another thing, but thank you all for your interest in these topics, and I will look forward to reconnecting with you in another future briefing.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. Casey, there's another question for you. How is this affecting the publishing industry? Are publishers themselves self-banning books that may be considered controversial?
Yeah, I mean, a big area that, Penn has heard about anecdotally, but we have not been able to study in the same rigorous way that we've been able to track instances of book bans is this idea of self-censorship. And I think it could happen at many different levels. I think it could happen, with publishers. I think it could happen how schools are identifying books for classrooms. It's certainly happening as educators think about their own classroom libraries and the books that they're bringing in. It probably happens in instruction in general. So I think there's many ways in which this sort of what we call, a chilling effect, or this atmosphere of intimidation, is leading to self-censorship across many levels. We have seen publishers get charged up here, and I think Penguin Random House is part of a lawsuit with Penn America, as well as authors and parents from a school district in Florida to file suit against that school district for infringements on First Amendment and 14th Amendment claims. We've also seen the way publishers and associations are responding to the Texas legislation that I mentioned that would sort of governments mandate publishers and booksellers and others to put ratings on books around the sexual content. So rating books for either being sexually relevant or sexually explicit. So we've seen many publishers come forward and say, we're challenging that as unconstitutional as well. So we do see, more and more sort of publishers speaking out on this.
Thank you so much, Casey. Our last speaker for today is Evelyn Alleman. Evelyn, welcome. Evelyn will share a parent's perspective, as well as the learning gap that many students faced coming back to school post-pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. And good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are in different parts of the world. My name is Evelyn Alleman. I'm founder of Our Voice Communities for Quality Education. We are a group of parents and students who advocate for quality education, not just in LA Unified.
Evelyn, so sorry, could you slow down a little bit for our interpreters?
Sure.
Thank you.
I want to be mindful of the time. We are a group of parent volunteers and students, college students, who came together 3 years ago during the start of the pandemic to address the lack of real lived experiences in education, specifically from Latino immigrant and Indigenous immigrant families in LA County. And we are primarily on social media. We know that parents have access to phones. We know that they have access to Facebook. And so via Facebook, we've been able to connect through our social media pages on Facebook and then on Instagram for college students. But when we first started, parents, Latino immigrant and Indigenous immigrant parents would just come on and just cry, right? Because this is a population that is voiceless when it comes to accessing critical information, such as the information that is being shared here today. There just really isn't information in Spanish language media that covers a lot of the, I guess you can say, higher level issues. And the one issue we didn't talk about here is the science of learning, right? The science of reading, which has been extensively covered in the New York Times and NPR. And so we take that information, my college interns and I take that information and we create graphics in Spanish so that our parents can also be attuned to what's happening in those higher level education conversations that they just do not have access to. What do our Latino parents care about? What they care about is safety in their schools. And safety as covered by mainstream media is very different to what Latino immigrant and indigenous immigrant parents perceive as safety. They want safety from drugs on their campuses, okay? Safety from fentanyl. They want awareness campaigns which just don't exist. We have intervention, we don't have awareness. They want their school police on campus, something that is largely unpopular. They're not saying municipal police, they're saying their school police. And the question is why, right? And the reason is because they live in communities that have high crime and a high number of indigence or homelessness. And so their parents don't feel safe sending their children to school, and most of them use public transportation or walk to school, and they don't feel safe having their children walk home. Right? So there are a number of reasons why they see safety as critical. And that affects absenteeism, because if the parents don't feel safe sending their children to a school, they just won't. They also want safety from COVID. COVID is still around. They live in multi-generational households. Many of the families have chronic illnesses. I have numerous parents stating that their children consistently get COVID in the classroom, even over the summer, and bring it home to infect them. And their primary, I have a mom who's a widow, has 4 children, head of household, has her mother living with her. So many of these stories that just don't make it into the mainstream media, right? And even when we have strikes, right? Even when we have strikes and our parents understand and want school workers to have a decent living wage, they are also the most affected because they are undocumented immigrants and they sell door to door. And many of these parents have children who are special needs. So even the solutions that we think are out there to help parents during strikes, that's not happening for our families. Our families are 74% of LA Unified, more than half of the student population in public schools in California. But these lived experiences and stories are left out. And that's what we're trying, our voice is trying to get out to the media and trying to get out to our leadership. We met with our superintendent, LA Unified superintendent, about 2 weeks ago. We met with him and we met with his staff for an hour. And we showed up with 9 issues that we want to put forth, that we are actively advocating for. And we were happy to hear that he aligns with all of them. So he aligns with all of them, but we need to see what that means, right? Because again, there are political pressures and there are understandings of the issues that are very different to what our Latino immigrant and indigenous immigrant families need and experience. So that's in a gist what we're dealing with, whether it comes to English language learners, early detection of dyslexia. You know, the Latino parents experience it in one way in trying to access resources, which is almost impossible. And the level of advocacy they have to do is unbelievable, right? And often on their own with language barriers. And if they are indigenous, the barriers are even higher, right? But they're going up against groups who claim to represent them, right? And even nonprofit groups who claim to represent them. And so our voice is out there getting the real stories of these parents on the ground out into the media. Even when NPR will say to me, we want to interview one of your parents, but they have to speak English. And I'll say to NPR, why, that doesn't make any sense. We're 74% of the student population. My parents don't speak English, right? And they'll say, then I can't do the story. Unbelievable, right? But it happens. So this is what we're committed to. It is necessary. It is oftentimes unpopular, but if we're here to tell the truth and tell the truth to power in its entirety, then some of us have to have the courage to step up and tell these stories as they need to be told.
Lynn, thank you so much. Could you share the list of issues that you presented to the LA superintendent? What were some of the key issues that you want them to address?
Well, safety overall was one of them. We want a prevention campaign for for drug awareness, starting in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, a response in that way specifically, not just intervention when it's kind of already late, right? Kids are already doing drugs. We want prevention first and foremost. The parents want more of support with LAPD, LA school police, redefining the role of the police. The parents aren't saying the police are the answer. They're saying, let's work together to hire more social workers and psychologists and counselors, but let's also talk about the need for school police. There is still a need for that, and how together all of these factors can make for safe campuses, right? So that's another conversation we're having. And then COVID, right? What do we do in December and January when those numbers go up? How do we protect our families? We're not saying you've got to have a mask mandate all year round, but let's talk honestly about what that's going to look like for 74% of the student population who are still afraid of bringing the virus home. And let's come up with a solution. So that's number one, school safety. And of course, safe passages is a main one. Another one is English language learners. What's holding up the transition into mainstream coursework by the time that they're in high school? We need better answers. We talked about early detection of dyslexia, right? And what's the holdup there? We talked about transition. The big one is transition to post high school. How are schools supporting these students who are graduating, right? And then don't know how to continue on to college or a technical career. What are the supports? LAUSD offers about 600, one counselor per 600 to 800 students. The National Association of Counselors says it should be 200 to 250. So kids aren't getting a chance to get in there and speak to their counselor. And they usually just speak to them for 15 minutes their senior year. So we challenge the superintendent, what are you doing about this? 74% of our children are Latino. They are not represented equally in our public universities and colleges. What are you doing? How are you tracking that progress? What's the feedback to the high schools so that they can change what needs to be changed? So just in a nutshell, but there were so many other issues. We have 9 issues that we're pushing, but those are the most critical 4, I believe.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions for you. Pilar Marrero wishes to ask a question. Pilar. Pilar?
Okay, I couldn't mute until now. Hi, everyone. Hi, Evelyn. I'm so thankful that you were able to make it today because your presentation was really eye-opening, as the other presentations were all very amazing. I just wanted you to give us an update on, the last time you and I talked, and I talked to some of your parents, we talked about the learning gap post-COVID and the tutoring efforts that LAUSD is undergoing, is having. How's that going? Is that working? Have things improved?
Thank you for saying that. I met with the head organizer for the nonprofit working on that in the Southeast cities. And he said that maybe about 6,000 children out of 60,000 in the Southeast cities have received what they call high quality tutoring. That's one-on-one tutoring. 6,000 out of 60,000 children in the Southeast cities. Now, mind you, this was done in collaboration with the mayors of Huntington Park and Southgate, who put grant money toward a program to get these kids at the parents' request that high level tutoring, because they've fallen behind in their learning during COVID. So 6,000 is not nearly enough. And that's just one little area of LA County. You know, it doesn't respond to the 500,000 children just in LA Unified, right? But we're not talking about even LA County. So not enough, Pilar. Not to answer your question, not nearly enough, not nearly enough. And, you know, lots of issues. And that's coming from the parents who know that their kids have fallen behind. That's not even talking about special ed students, right? That's not even talking about English language learners. Right? It's serious.
Final question from Peter Sherman. Peter.
Hi, am I on mute or can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Just very quickly, look, I'm a parent as well. And I had a hard time forming a relationship with the school, half the time feeling like I had to advocate for my kid against the school. And so I'm wondering, is all these, you know, the relationship between schools and parents is so critical, yet often you see these hostile relationships between parents and schools. Parents feel like the schools are out to get their kids or are not treating their kids fairly. I'm wondering, in this political context, with everything that's been introduced here, very succinctly, how would you define the relationship that parents have with schools today?
That's a great question, Peter. And I would say, in speaking and working with Latino and Indigenous parents, I'll add another layer to that: racism. I just had a mom say to me, I feel like I was treated so badly. I felt like I was attacked personally because I don't speak the language, and it was racism. So a lot of the parents feel that way about the way that they're treated. The school climate is a big one for us, right? How you're welcomed into a store, just as how you're into a school, just as how you're welcomed into a store, right? Will make you determine whether or not you want to shop there or not. At a school, it's a little bit more complicated because you're invested, right? It's part of your community. It's your center, right? Your focus. And then your children spend most of their time there. So a lot of parents are reticent to say anything. They want to advocate, but they're so afraid because they fear retaliation toward the children. What you experience is what, like, most of the parents experience, myself included, when my children were in K through 12. So that is something also we are trying to bring up with the superintendent. He's aware, right? And let's not just talk about LA Unified. Let's talk about charter schools. This happens everywhere. They're aware of it. But, you know, with the best intentions, at the end of the day, the leadership, right? Best intentions from the leadership and best efforts from the leadership. At the end of the day, the parents have to walk into their schools, and in LAUSD's case, they don't know what happens, right? They're not going to know how the parents are treated unless they have like secret shoppers, you know, secret parents, which is a great idea. But, you know, it's going to deter people. I've had a mom crying because she was treated so badly. I'm trying to just get an apology from LAUSD from her. I've had other parents who send their kids to charter school saying, I didn't like how I was treated. So we have to help parents understand that they do have choice, that they don't deserve to be treated this way, that is not, and help schools understand what parent engagement really is like, and that school climate begins with the secretary, with the welcome, and that matters, and that will also impact their ability to retain students at those schools.
To all our speakers and reporters, thank you so much for joining us today for a very, very robust and useful conversation. We end today's briefing. See you next Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.